Good afternoon. I'm Violet Zariello, Marketing Manager at American Experience, PBS's flagship and longest running history series. Thank you for being here. Past Forward, Conversations with American Experience is our monthly virtual conversation series where we discuss the enduring themes explored in our films with historians and experts. Today's Past Forward conversation explores the impact of pandemic movies and books on America's perception of real outbreaks. It is inspired in part by our new documentary, Plague at the Golden Gate, which is now available to stream on our website and in the PBS video app. Plague at the Golden Gate tells the gripping story of the race against time to save San Francisco and the nation from a deadly outbreak of bubonic plague in 1900 that set off fear and anti-Asian sentiment in San Francisco. The film is a fascinating medical mystery and timely examination of the relationship between the medical community, city power brokers, and the Chinese American community. In today's conversation, our guests will discuss the popularity of books, movies, and shows about viruses and pandemics, and connect what we see on the screen to how scientists and doctors deal with outbreaks in real life. They'll delve into the technology of virus hunting, both in real life and in the movies, examine the political and social norms reflected in the media and in reality, and draw comparisons between pandemics of the past and the present. As always, this is meant to be an interactive conversation. I invite you to write questions in the live chat, and we'll answer as many as possible during the discussion. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge our corporate sponsor, Liberty Mutual Insurance. I'd also like to acknowledge the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation, the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, members of the Better Angels Society, including the Fullerton Family Charitable Fund and Philip I. Kent Charitable Fund, the Robert David Lyon Gardner Foundation, the Documentary Investment Group, PBS, our home station GBH, and of course, viewers like you. Now it's my privilege to introduce our panel for this conversation. Dr. Ian Lipkin is a professor of epidemiology, pathology, and neurology, and is the director of the Center for Infection and Immunity at Columbia University's Mailman School of Public Health. He was also the scientific advisor on the 2011 film Contagion. Marilyn Chase is a former health reporter for the Wall Street Journal and author of The Barbary Plague, The Black Death in Victorian San Francisco, published by Random House. Her most recent book, Everything She Touched, The Life of Ruth Osawa, was published in 2020 by Chronicle Books. Thank you again, and please enjoy the conversation.
Thank you, Violet, and welcome, Ian. It's great to be with you today to talk about the impact of pandemic movies and books on America's perception of real outbreaks. This conversation is based in part on the new American Experience documentary, Plague at the Golden Gate, which tells the story of a plague outbreak in San Francisco at the turn of the century, with so many parallels to the time that we're currently living through. So, why do audiences flock to pandemic horror movies, dystopian blockbusters, and zombie apocalypses, especially in a time of real life crisis, turmoil, upheaval of all kinds, war abroad, and civil insurrection at home? Ian, I've been wanting to ask you, are folks insatiable for fantasy horrors as a distraction from real life challenges?
They're almost like Westerns. They have a similar sort of an arc. Truth and justice prevail in the end, so we have a vacation from our everyday lives.
Well, it seems that while some epidemic thrillers focus on disease and medical realities, others pack in a whole smorgasbord of terrors. For example, in a 2016 classic from Korea, The Train to Busan, a virus turns victims into zombies raging around, and it's also packed with car crashes, train crashes, and terrified mobs breaking through windows. So do dystopian blockbusters have to stick to the facts, or what's up with the sort of everything but the kitchen sink style of dystopian horror movie, do you think?
Well, I love these films, particularly the ones that are really campy. I have a lecture I give called Bad Bugs on the Big Screen that takes you through things like Night of the Living Dead, Last Man on Earth, the Omega Man, Outbreak, all of these things, and looks at two completely different views of how you get to these horrific creatures. One of them really sort of comes out of the old Greek mythology, Prometheus, right, who brings down the fire from Mount Olympus for humans. We see a lot of that with these efforts to sort of do chromosomal chiropractic to create these new cures for cancer that go awry, right, which is what happens in several of these. The other thing that's a constant theme is these zombies who basically disintegrate whenever they come to contact with light, which again harkens back to all sorts of old mythology. But some of them are so implausible that they're fun in their own right. So one of my favorites is one called The Warning Sign that was informed in part by conversations somebody had with a very famous virologist named Neil Nathanson about a virus that I studied for many years called Borna disease. And scientists are taking people through an animal laboratory where you see these rats that have been infected, they're jumping around. And instead of just putting a sign on the cage and saying, you know, sacrifice humanely, something like that, he pulls out a revolver and shoots them in the cage, which is something that would never happen. But it's one of those wow moments. Or you have in the Omega Man, Charlton Heston pulling out a submachine gun and shooting zombies. Or you have even more bizarre things that are sort of pseudoscientific, like an outbreak, where you have a group of people sitting around a photograph taken under an electron micrograph of Ebola virus. And one of the characters claims to be able to see why this Ebola virus is worse than any previously encountered because he can see it on the screen, which of course you can't. But the most obvious thing that they follow up is that they have some kid who's like some monkey that's running around the forest. His mother sees a picture on the screen. Dustin Hoffman is holding up this handwritten sign for the CDC to call if they see this monkey. They dart this monkey, and then overnight, they have enough serum to treat the entire world. The real irony is that they're shooting a capuchin monkey. A capuchin monkey is native to South America. It doesn't have anything to do with Central Africa, which is theoretically where it came from. So I like movies to be more plausible. And I hope we're going to get a chance to come back to that and how we think Contagion was different.
Absolutely. Well, I think I need to audit your class, so sign me up, Doc. Basically, one of my most burning questions to ask you today is whether, in your view, dystopian blockbusters spark curiosity in viewers about the real history of pandemics so that they engage with the science, or do they drive people deeper into sci-fi fantasy, conspiracy theories, and science denial? What do you think?
Well, I know that in 2011, Contagion came out. The CDC saw a big spike in applications for training with the Epidemiology Intelligence Service. And there was a big push of people going into infectious diseases. So at least in some portion of the population, it's been a very, very useful recruitment tool. I'm sure there are people who will take this stuff to heart, though, just as there are people who thought that there were children being abused, you know, in the back of some pizzeria in Washington, D.C., right? So it's hard to know how people are going to interpret these sorts of things. But at least in my field, it's been really useful in pushing forward things like funding and so on.
Well, that's really good to know. You recall when plague was diagnosed, bubonic plague in San Francisco in 1900, the cause of disease was as yet unknown, misinformation was widespread, and white residents were very quick to incorrectly blame and scapegoat the Chinese Americans living in the city. Let's watch a clip now from the film, from the American Experience, that speaks to this.
Kenyon knew all about buboes, where the word bubonic comes from. The swollen lymph nodes were an infamous sign of the plague. Yet he also knew that they weren't enough for a diagnosis, and he had to be 100% certain.
To prove a plague death scientifically, you couldn't just do it by examining the live patient or the cadaver. You had to isolate the organism from tissue.
In 1900, microbiology was still a fledgling field, and the idea that germs could cause disease was not fully accepted, even by many doctors. Kenyon's superior, Surgeon General Walter Wyman, had himself published a paper on the plague that was full of speculations and misinformation. That the disease was spread by dust, tainted food, and contaminated objects. Wyman also endorsed racial theories of the time, that the disease targeted Asians while sparing whites.
Surgeon General Wyman himself said it was only a disease of rice eaters. If you ate a quote-unquote muscular diet of meat, you were somehow immune to it.
Such ignorance was widespread, due in part to the fact that scientific confirmation could take years. Nevertheless, European scientists had recently identified the bubonic plague bacteria using a test called Gram stain.
Bubonic plague is transmitted by bacteria called Yersinia pestis. And Gram stains are used under the microscope to enhance the difference in colors so you can see the bacteria in what we call a smear on a slide. And Yersinia pestis stains pink.
As the first American to have studied the bacilli, Kenyon was unquestionably the most qualified scientist in the country to test for plague. Hours after Wong's death, he undertook the exacting forensic work, using the sample taken from the body.
Isolate the germ in biopsy, test it with the Gram stain. Put it under a microscope and look for the distinctive pink rod-shaped bacilli with rounded tips. And that was the classic signature of plague.
Yet the presence of the telltale marker alone wasn't enough to confirm a diagnosis. Kenyon would have to grow the culture in his lab, which would take time. And there was none to spare. For he couldn't help but wonder how many others might be infected. Across San Francisco Bay, the City Board of Health was too spooked to wait. To them, it was clearly a Chinese problem, confined to Chinatown. So they decided to control matters by quarantining the entire district. One day after Wong Chut-king's death, the Chinese community awoke to find ropes cordoning off their 12-block district. Overnight, 20,000 people, nearly all of the city's Asians, found themselves virtual prisoners.
So, as we saw in San Francisco in 1900 with the plague, and in countless outbreaks since then, from the 1918 flu to HIV/AIDS, why is it so common for the public to blame the outsiders, the other, or minorities? For example, immigrants or gay men, minorities, for disease outbreaks, and for politicians to use this reflexive scapegoating as a way to escape responsibility. What do you think, Ian?
Well, this is not something that's new. Even in plague in the 14th century, Jews were blamed for the plague. And then we had witch hunts. I think this is just part of human nature, is to refocus failures on vulnerable populations. And as you remember, the whole idea of a scapegoat was you put all the sins onto the goat and you would sacrifice the goat. So this is precisely what we do with humans. Now, I don't know that, now some people I think do this deliberately, politicians I think you're referring to, but there are other people who are misguided and are sincere, and the problem is how to reach them. So there are examples, and I think, everyone is aware of this, where people think that vaccines, for example, cause autism or other kinds of disorders, which they clearly do not, but nonetheless, these have actually prevented us from implementing as successfully as we might like in some vulnerable populations the SARS-CoV-2 vaccines during the current pandemic.
Absolutely. Well, thinking a little bit about the pop culture formula for epidemic stories, some of them have the trope of the lone hero or the aha moment or the anecdotal climax where a single patient recovers and then poof, it's over like a miracle, to coin a phrase. Does that hurt public understanding of what epidemics really are? And are the true facts about pandemic spread, prevention, and treatment too much of a buzzkill for some movies?
I think you've nailed it, Marilyn. This is a phenomenon that was, I think, originally described by Joseph Campbell, who was looking back at all the different heroes throughout history, the heroes with 1,000 faces, which gave rise to Lucas' vision for Star Wars. The audience wants struggle, epiphany, and success. This is really, I didn't really appreciate this quite as well until about, probably 8-9 years ago, when an editor publisher friend of mine invited me to lunch in a very famous restaurant in the Chelsea Hotel. He suggested that I write a memoir. I said, it's much too early for me to look back. I'm trying to look forward. And I said, how about instead if I do an update of the famous Paul the Croup book, Microbe Hunters? And he said, oh, okay, I'll take a look. So I gave him a draft of what it really looks like to solve a problem. And I took polio. And in addition to talking about people like Sabin and Salk, who everybody knows, I talked about Enders, and Weller, and Robbins, and Kaprowski, and Bodie, and all these people, and describing all the different components that went into the development of a successful poliovirus vaccine. And he pushed back and he said, look, it's too many people, too complicated. We need a hero who perseveres against the odds, fights his peers, and saves the day. And I think that sort of thing, which I alluded to earlier with the Western, is what we all want to see. We want to somehow have an avatar with whom we can relate, to whom we can relate, who carries the day. And that's really the recipe for a great disaster movie.
Exactly. We all crave simplicity and clarity. And sometimes we go too far. Pop culture and even the media, journalists in my field, sometimes we throw around and conflate and confuse terms like bacteria and viruses even, which are, of course, different agents of infection. So we know bacteria respond to antibiotics, and we know that viruses don't, and that antiviral drugs are different. But if we in the media can't get it right, how can we expect the public, inundated with data during a growing pandemic, to understand and make wise choices for their families?
I'm sensitive to that. I appreciate that. The principle, though, is frequently the same. And that's why infectious disease physicians take care of people with bacterial infections as well as viral infections. In any instance, when you're developing a vaccine, the idea is to prevent disease associated with infection, whether it's a bacterium or a virus. If you're using a drug, the idea is to prevent that virus or that bacterium or that fungus from reproducing. And if you look at the principles that we've examined, just for example, with triple drug therapy, which Many people think really began with HIV/AIDS. It didn't. We were using it for tuberculosis 30 years earlier. So there's a lot, I think, that we can learn from bacterial and viral infections studied in parallel. Furthermore, frequently they act in concert to cause more disease. So we saw that really during the flu pandemic back in 1918. And initially, people thought it was bacterium. That's why there's a bacterium called Haemophilus influenza, because it was thought to be the causative agent. When you went back and look at the most recent influenza epidemic, we had people who had streptococcal infection. So they might be, incapacitated, made vulnerable by the viral infection, but the bacterial one was the one that was actually the one that resulted in the fatal outcome.
Well, as a health reporter during my career at the Wall Street Journal, and also as I was researching my book on plague, the Barbary Plague, Black Death in Victorian San Francisco, I always tried to talk to as many people like you as I could and cover the sort of less seen side of science, the shoe leather epidemiology and all of the wonderful sleuthing to track down disease cases and causes and all the meticulous lab work and the long, risky, expensive clinical and preclinical work and the trials to find solutions and test treatments. In Plague at the Golden Gate, the documentary, we learn how the news media, however, put science on trial rather than reporting these facts. Let's watch another clip now that speaks to this.
Nine days after Wong Chuk King's death, Kenyon confirmed 3 more cases, all within Chinatown. Kenyon had feared such an outbreak all along, knowing that even a handful of cases could explode exponentially into a national epidemic within weeks. The urgency of the situation caught the eye of newspaper magnate William Randolph Hearst. On March 18th, his paper, the New York Journal, published a special national edition trumpeting the sensational story from California. Pressured by commercial stakeholders, San Francisco's leaders quickly responded, enlisting the editors of leading newspapers to dismiss what they now called rumors.
City Hall and all of San Francisco's elite, they had the same idea in mind. We're not going to report any news of the plague. You have the Chronicle saying, or we're going to write editorials saying that Kenyon or anybody else from the Marine Hospital Service is just trying to pick San Francisco's pocket.
Dr. Joseph Kenyon was a proud man. He regarded the tools of science, the enlightenment of his technology, as a gift. And he expected, quite rightly, some deference and respect for what he brought to the city. And he got none of it. Because from the moment that Joseph Kenyon diagnosed plague in the glands of Wong Chuk King, science was on trial.
So Ian, reflecting on all this, do you feel that science is still on trial in our day in the United States?
I think it is. I don't know that this is true of the entire population, but there are many people who are very angry with the approach that we've taken to addressing this pandemic. And you've seen this by the fact that prominent scientists like Anthony Fauci now have security details. I could share with you some hate mail threatening me with bodily harm. That's, exhausting. I think in part, some of this is our fault, however, because it's critical that if we don't get it right from the start, that we admit that. Some people don't realize that science is it's an evolving sort of process. We may not know as much as we'd like, and you saw that through the film that accompanies this piece. where there are changes in the way people think about how you approach the problem. Is it local containment? Does it have to be larger? And so forth. We've had the same sort of situation during the current pandemic where, we had problems with the testing at the get-go, but we've also had extraordinary successes with the vaccines. But people misunderstood the way the vaccines work. The thought was that the vaccines were going to prevent transmission from person to person. And that was not their primary goal. Their primary goal was to reduce morbidity and mortality associated with disease. We have to be very careful about what we promise and make sure that we underpromise and overdeliver. I talked a little bit earlier about autism and MMR vaccine. You have to realize that once something is published, the knowledge, the sort of thought in the public is that this has somehow received the imprimatur of the whole scientific community, as though we vote in a block and we don't. So this publication that came out in 1998, 20 years later, is making it difficult for us to promote vaccines that are essential and life-saving. It's sort of like the functional equivalent of trying to unring a bell. It really can't be done. So we need to be very cautious about what we present and how we present it.
Quite so. Well, given this tendency of the public to make snap judgments and sometimes misjudgments about the purposes of tests and vaccines and even treatments, do doctors and scientists make good pop culture heroes in films and such? And again, does it help or hurt?
Well, I'm most familiar with Contagion. We had three heroes, right? We had Kate Winslet, who died investigating the epidemic. We had Jennifer Ely, who developed the vaccine. And we had Elliot Gould, who found a way to grow the virus. I should say parenthetically that I was told that Matt Damon, not Elliot Gould, was going to play me. They both become very good friends. But in any event, my mother was much more excited because she did not know who Matt Damon was, but she knew who Elliot Gould was. So yes, we have heroes. And in that film, I think they were really very, very effective.
Well, that leads me to jump ahead a couple of questions and to congratulate you, because some blockbuster movies, thanks to folks like you, managed to sneak in some core truths. For example, just as you did in Steven Soderbergh's 2011 now classic thriller Contagion, starring Gwyneth Paltrow and Matt Damon. The woman returns, if there's anyone who hasn't seen it, a woman returns from a business trip in Asia, feeling she just has a touch of jet lag and suddenly dies of an overwhelming epidemic disease. And it touches on real life themes of transmission and mutation and contact tracing, and even the fear that someone might use germs as bioterror weapons. So Lawrence Fishburne has the best line in the movie, and I hope that you wrote it. He says at one point, "Nobody has to weaponize bird flu. The birds are doing it for us." So what was it like to be the science advisor to a major blockbuster film?
Well, it was a lot of fun. I worked very closely with Scott C. Burns, who's a brilliant writer. And frankly, I don't think screenwriters get enough credit because without the screenwriter, you wouldn't have the content. And of course, the blocking and the direction of the actors and everything else, the director's critical. But it all really begins in the mind of the screenwriter, and he's terrific. That particular line that you're talking about was to reflect a point that we realized, when we built the biodefense centers after 9/11. People always remember the fact that we lost the Twin Towers, but there were also anthrax attacks in DC and elsewhere that we may not reflect on quite as much. Fact remains that this led to our being concerned about the development of biological weapons, and people are talking about now again that sort of risk in Eastern Europe. One of the points that Anthony Fauci made, was that we have to be concerned about emerging infectious diseases because they are at least as great, if not a greater threat than bioterrorism. Now, I think that we need to be concerned about both. And the fact remains that the toolkit is the same. We need to improve the way we approach the whole issue of surveillance. We need to take the what we call the sort of the international health regulations of 2005 that said every country had to be able to diagnose infectious diseases within its borders and to share those kinds of data transparently. We will see more infectious diseases emerge, as you've seen already now. We've got monkeypox, and there will be others as well. We didn't get everything correct, obviously, with Contagion, and there are some errors. But at the end of the day, we also have to have a movie that people are going to want to watch.
Sure. Well, was there a process of negotiation between you and the makers of the film, and how did you communicate the scientific truths in your story conferences? Were they committed to scientific accuracy from the get-go, or did you have a little bit of persuasion to do?
So this is one of the funnier stories, I think, about the making of Contagion. So on 2 consecutive evenings in 2009, I met with 2 different screenwriters, both of whom I did not know at the time, both of whom have become now close friends, representing 2 different directors who simultaneously had the idea that it was time to make a disaster film. It was a zeitgeist in 2009. One of them wanted to make something that was going to be spectacular with all sorts of ghouls. The other one wanted to make something that was going to be much more realistic. That came out of Jeff Skoll's group. You're right, Participant Media. They make all kinds of great stuff that is educational as well as entertaining. So I spent a lot of time with Scott. We spent about 2-3 hours, and at the end of that period, I was absolutely persuaded that he was serious about making something that would be scientifically valid as much as possible. So we both committed to multiple rewrites. And as we became closer and I got to enjoy these people, I helped them design the sets and the costumes, travel with the actors, invited Jennifer and Kate to spend a couple of days in the lab, learning how to grow cells and run polymerase chain reaction assays. And I spent 6 weeks on set. There was one instance where I asked Stephen to reshoot a scene that was inaccurate. So Jennifer Ely has created this vaccine, and she's very excited to inject it. And she's wearing tights, and she injects through the tights. So I'm doing this, I'm looking at the sound check, reading it, watching the footage, and I say, wait a second, this is not what we agreed to. She would have rolled down her tights and she would have wiped off her thigh with an alcohol swab before she did this. So we had to bring her back with her husband and her 2 kids to reshoot about 15 seconds. But they did it.
Good job. Good job. Have there been any other movies besides Contagion that, to your mind, got it right?
Well, there are a couple that could have got it right. I was involved with a few others. One was the latest James Bond movie, where we're trying to invent a biological weapon. They decided not to go with the weapon that I proposed. There was another one, Utopia, that I think was very good too. But if you don't appeal to the audience, if you don't have an audience that comes back and stays, then you haven't succeeded either. So it's a fine line. So when Stephen originally started trying this movie and looking at it with the audience, you look for when people begin to shift around in their seats. And if it gets to a certain point, when it's clear that they're getting antsy, you've got to cut. So there's some things that wound up on the cutting room floor, but not much. I'm very happy with the outcome.
Will you share with us the bioweapon that you were going to invent that got on the cutting room floor?
I can't.
You can't, because then they'd have to kill you.
Yes, it's like, what was his name? Q or M or whoever the one it was who came up with the Inspector Gadget stuff. That was sort of my job for this movie, but they went a different way.
Right. Well, as you said earlier in our conversation, there's really nothing new under the sun. A lot of these themes are perennial ones. And of course, literature has its share of classic plague tales, going back to Boccaccio's Decameron in 1353 and Journal of the Plague Year by Daniel Defoe in 1722, and then a host of new and ever-growing list of pandemic thrillers from the publishing world. Do you have a favorite or favorites?
Well, I read Decameron, I read The Plague. They're excellent, but not contemporary. The best sort of recent disaster tale I read was End of October by my friend Larry Wright, which I think it's a really good read. Some people may find it strikes a little too close to home in 2021, but I'd recommend it.
Very good, very good. Geraldine Brooks, formerly of the Wall Street Journal, a few years back, wrote a book called Year of Wonders, which is a marvelous historical novel about a tiny village in England that quarantined itself to try to escape the bubonic plague. And it's just a lovely textured work. But we're getting on to the point where we're going to ask our audience to submit some questions, but I have a couple of others if I have time to sneak them in. I wanted to ask you, what about the movie Philadelphia starring Tom Hanks, which humanized the AIDS pandemic and to my mind sort of had that kind of magical mix of dramatic catharsis and also creation of understanding and compassion. Maybe that's what Aristotle was going for with the release of pity and terror that lets us grow and somehow enlarges our spirit. What do you think?
Well, first of all, it was a great movie, particularly the scenes with opera and Tom Hanks and Antonio Banderas. Nobody knew who he was, except for those of us who watched some of his earlier work, which wasn't quite as popular. He just spectacular acting. Beautiful, beautiful film.
Right. It was really nuanced. Can we talk about COVID? Is there a pop culture platform, book, television, film that you think could both divert people in a trying time, but also inform and guide us? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, I think that's a great project for you and me to do together.
Okay.
We can talk about that offline.
All right.
I think there's room for it. I haven't seen anything yet, though, as I say, Larry's book is really good. And if you haven't read it, I'd recommend it.
It's on my list. Well, recent events have sort of flipped the script, or maybe gone back to a bad old script on public views of heroes and villains, where we now see, as you alluded to a moment ago, NIH leaders defamed and even menaced. What's behind this, and what can we do about? Is just another example of science on trial. Have we learned anything since 1900?
Well, I'll give you an example from current day. The squabbling about where this virus originated. Did it come from the Wuhan market? Did it come from a laboratory in Wuhan? Did it come from the CDC in Wuhan? And so forth. The bottom line is that we don't know. We probably will never know. If we think in terms of what is most plausible, it almost certainly came from some sort of transmission from a wild animal, given that there were 40,000 animals sitting there in this Wuhan market at one point or another. Probability is high that one of them might have been infected with this particular virus. But the fact is, going forward, we have to do science under the safest of circumstances. We should not have any wild animal markets. But how are you going to change that culture, which is thousands of years old? And in a country the size of China, how can people in Beijing possibly know what's happening in an alley way in Wuhan or someplace else? So when I first started going to China in the early 2000s, there were wild animal markets around the block from the Beijing hotel. Now that's no longer the case, but we can't just say that's the only place you have these animal markets, because I've seen wild animal markets in Vietnam, I know they're in Cambodia. And if you look at wild animals that are imported into the US or into France, we're not blameless. So we've seen, I've looked at animal carcasses, primates and so forth that come into JFK and have studied them and have found viral sequences that would be of concern. And I'm sure the same thing would be true any place you have an international network. So there's no question but that we need to change the way we live and interact. And as a function of climate change, we're going to see more and more animals that are going to be driven out of various forests, and jungles, and wild areas, come into contact with people. You're going to see more and more spillover events. So this is something we need to be prepared to address.
We need to keep working. Well, we have a very engaged bunch of audience members who are already asking questions. So if I can take the first question here. One audience member asks, how do you think the COVID pandemic will change the way filmmakers make these types of movies going forward? And do you think that audiences will still like them?
Well, I can tell you right now, because I've been involved with creating the protocols for Hollywood for the Directors Guild and the unions and so forth, that it has changed the way we approach making films. It's made them more expensive to do, it's made them more cumbersome to do, and so on. So that is one aspect. Do I think it's really going to change whether or not people are going to be interested in this virus or that virus? Probably not. I think that the formula is still the same. It's like, as I said at the beginning, it's like Westerns. People want to see some sort of a threat. A hero comes and addresses it and gets it right. We had 3 heroes in Contagion, and some actors think we should have had only 1. It would have been somehow more compelling. But that's, again, we were trying to make something that reflected the way things really happen. So going back to the polio story, people know the name Salk, they know the name Sabin. They don't know the 3 people who found a way to grow the virus without which you couldn't have made those vaccines. And the Nobel Prize did not go to Salk or to Sabin or Kaprowski. And Kaprowski had the first vaccine.
Wow.
Which is another sort of interesting story that we could go into. It went to the 3 people who found a way to grow the virus. So a lot of the early stuff that's critical to getting it right is never really recognized except within the community.
Well, here's another intriguing question. A viewer asks, which pandemic do you think has been the most misunderstood, either scientifically or by reception from the public?
Wow. So I'm the John Snow professor at Columbia University. Most people here won't know who John Snow is. John Snow was the one who recognized during the cholera outbreak in London in the 1800s that the source of contagion was a pump. And he managed to shut off the pump, and the cholera outbreak, was basically abrogated. When we think in terms of epidemics, most people think in terms of acute diseases, acute infectious diseases. I've got a much broader notion these days of contagion. I look at social media and misinformation and gun violence. All of these things are spreading like infectious diseases. And I think there are models that we can use that come out of the infectious disease world. We have to develop the functional equivalent of vaccination against ignorance and hatred and racism and sexism and so forth. So in terms of being most misunderstood and most critical, I can't think of anything more timely particularly given what happened just a few days ago.
Amen to that. Well, while battling against pop culture depictions of pandemics, at least the wrong-headed ones, not the ones that are on target, how can scientists reach people today through the noise? And that would include misrepresentations in social media.
So in the early days of this pandemic, Scott D. Burns and I, with Stephen, decided to make a series of little vignettes where we had the cast from Contagion talk to people about how to keep themselves safe. So we had Marion Cotillard and Kate and Jennifer and Lawrence and everybody in the cast have a bit where they would talk on camera with their own iPhone or Android phone. So you see them without makeup, which is interesting in its own right, talking about hand washing, distancing, and all of these kinds of things. And we put it up on the website at Columbia, and it had an impact. When we went back to start talking about vaccines and the importance of taking vaccines, I went back to Jennifer and others and said, it's time, it's time for us to do something like this. And Brian Cranston said to me, I'm happy to do this if you think it's going to make a difference. But I got to be frank with you and tell you, I'm just a movie person. Why should anybody listen to me? And we thought about it. We realized they were right. So we went out into the community and we got brown people, Black people, men, women, older people, clergy, Orthodox Jews, anybody who represented a population that we felt was somehow underserved, undervaccinated. And we got them all to write their own statements and present them on camera. And I'd like to think that it had an impact and hope that it had an impact. So what we need to do is we need to find ways to reach people. Maybe it's social media, maybe it's games, I don't know. But this is something that we have to focus on.
Good topic for further brainstorming. Here's a question that just came through. Could we have handled our governmental response to COVID better? I don't want to put you on the hot seat too much, but was there a better path forward from the get-go? And what mistakes did we make in communicating about the disease, if any?
So I think there are always things that one could do better. And I think, in medicine and science, we have what we call a post-mortem. We go back and try to figure out what we got right and what we got wrong. I think that if you go back historically and look at the biodefense program that came out of 9/11, that was developed by, Bush 43, it was a terrific program. It jump-started emerging infectious disease and biodefense research in the United States. We had a program there called the National Biosurveillance Advisory Subcommittee that released a series of recommendations that frankly weren't really realized to the extent that they should have been. During the Obama administration, we didn't really change that path either. I'm hoping this time we will get it right. We need to have experts speaking on behalf of scientists. One of the challenges right now at the CDC, I think, is that, first of all, it's undermanned, it's underpaid, it's underfunded, and it's asked to do a great deal. And I don't know that they could have done much better. There's no question but that there were missteps with the original development of the test kits, which were a problem for us. I think, however, Operation Warp Speed that began during the Trump administration was a great, success. I mean, look at how well we did there. I think that the use of plasma, although some people think that that is, controversial, I think plasma therapy will prove, in retrospect, to have been very, very useful. So there are many things that we got right. What didn't we get right? We should have started focusing on trying to persuade people of the value of vaccines at a much earlier time point. Furthermore, we should have focused on other types of vaccines that result in the kind of immunity that interrupts chains of transmission. And those would have been vaccines that work at mucosal surfaces like the mouth and the nose. And we still don't have many of those. They're by far the minority of vaccines.
Interesting that you're talking about a route of administration that I believe they showed in the movie Contagion. It was an intranasal vaccine.
It was indeed an intranasal vaccine. And the reason it was an intranasal vaccine is because that's what I wanted. And Scott said, yeah, that makes sense.
Prescient. Well, here's a not a softball question. A viewer asks, in your view, will we ever be out of this pandemic in our lifetime?
Wow, that's a very good question. You could make the argument that we are, or you could make the argument that we aren't. So will this virus ever be eradicated? No. This is like opening Pandora's box, and all the theories are out. And now we have is hope, and hope is vaccines and diagnostics and drugs and so forth. Will we have it under control? Yes. But that is all dependent upon how we handle ourselves. So we have to be prepared to vaccinate the world. This community is interdigitated closer than ever before. We are linked economically, socially, structurally, spiritually. So if we had started earlier with vaccines, I think that we would be in better shape. Now we have an opportunity, I think, for example, with this monkeypox outbreak, which is now several hundred people, to be also engaged in an international way in ensuring that we use the sort of ring vaccination strategy that was so helpful in eradicating smallpox, a related virus, right?
Right.
So in fact, we can prevent this vaccine from becoming more generalized because it began in a specific population, but it will not stay there. This is not, strictly speaking, a sexually transmitted disease. Any sort of contact with something that is infectious can result in disease. And if you are somebody who's immunosuppressed, it can be a very, very serious problem.
Do you think that the media, even understanding how very serious this is and how we all need to be engaged in the effort toward better understanding and following good scientific advice, do you think that the media still makes epidemics and pandemics scarier than they need to be or than they actually are?
Well, I think that, and I don't like to use this term, the media, because there's so many different, facets, to how we get our information. But I do think it's interesting that there's a cycle which can turn over very, very rapidly. So you don't see a great deal right now on the pandemic. We've all shifted to the Ukraine and to Russia and to economic catastrophes and so forth. So I think what the media does, which we saw in Network, which incidentally was another great Bryan Cranston performance in that play, talks about it. It's sensational. The idea is to provide some sort of a commodity that people find entertaining. People like to read about things that are disturbing. And again, but they also would like to see some resolution. And I'm hoping we can provide them with that.
Right.
Not too distant future.
A very interesting conversation I had with an educational psychologist who's a big fan of dystopian pop culture. This gentleman said to me that he thought that when people feel that social progress is stymied or stalled out, that watching a dystopian zombie flick makes people feel a little less bad. I don't know if that's just a variant of Schadenfreude or what you would call it, but why do you think a feel-bad movie turns out to be a feel-good movie?
Well, again, at the end of this process that you go through with this movie, there's a resolution where the good people get right. That's terrific. You feel better for it. Again, I think that, I was watching yesterday, over the weekend, I was watching Dirty Harry, which is an amazing movie. Clint Eastwood, he has got these lines that he repeats twice, right? I know, and all the commotion, I can't remember, was it 5 shots or 6 and this kind of thing. He becomes your avatar, and the bad guy gets it in the end, and it's just, you feel relieved. That is your scapegoat. That is your resolution. That gives you, the optimism to go forward. I don't know why I admitted to seeing Dirty Harry, but I love that film. I watch it once every 20 years.
Whether you need to or not. Well, let's all hope that the good guys will prevail as they do in the movies. Thank you all for joining us today. It's been a delight to talk with you and to engage with our viewers. And now I will pass it back to Violet for closing remarks. Thanks again.
Thank you for joining us today for this conversation exploring what pop culture gets right and wrong about real pandemics. Plague at the Golden Gate is now available to stream in full on our website and in the PBS video app. You can watch our Past Forward conversations anytime on our YouTube channel or on our website. And if you liked what you saw today, please subscribe to our YouTube channel and sign up for our events newsletter. You'll be the first to know about new conversations, opportunities to watch new films live with us, and more. Thank you again for joining us. Have a great evening.